Well, I'm in Niles, Michigan at Silverbrook Cemetery today, and they're going to do a historic walking tour. And his Silverbrook Cemetery is one of the oldest cemeteries in southwest Michigan. The earliest burial date in this cemetery is 1830. So this should be quite interesting. Come along and join me.
Welcome to the 2022 Silverbrook Cemetery Tour. This is a partnership between the Niles History Center and the Friends of Silverbrook. So I welcome everybody this morning. Like I said, I'm so happy. It's a little chilly, but it's not raining. It's a beautiful morning for a walk through the cemetery. So for those of you who may not know, I'm going to give just a little bit of cemetery history here. In 1836, George Bond purchased 6 acres for use as a public cemetery. Then he purchased some more shortly after. 2 years after that initial purchase, the lots opened for public sale at Silverbrook here. Since that time, there have been several additions to the cemetery, including the original Bond sections. You have Old Ground, City, New, and Garden of Memory. Today, Silverbrook is still an active cemetery. The entrance that you guys drove in on over there is the cemetery's third. The original entrance was actually along where South 11th is today. We'll be walking by that in just a little while. The second entrance to the cemetery was right over here where we're standing today. And then they have the third one too, which is the one you see up in the front. This year, the tour is going to place special emphasis on the city section of the cemetery. Part of the reason why we met down here is the city section kind of goes back this way, so we thought we'd walk you part of the way too. The city section was laid out in the second part of the 19th century, and it's kind of interesting because at the time, the cemetery trustees hired someone by the name of Silas Ireland to lay out the area, and he created the first topographical map of the cemetery. He completed that work in 1878. So it was really the first official layout for the cemetery at that time. So we will be walking through the section, and we will be covering several families that are buried in that area. We'll also cover a couple families buried in, I think we hit Bond, and one family in the old section too. So all right, we're going to start heading down this way, and as we head down this path toward the city section, I just want to point out, you'll notice on the left you'll see a big sign. That is for the fence in the tree, and you can read about like what the significance of that was on the sign. It's kind of like a historical marker in the cemetery. So all right, we're going to head down this way. So many of these stump markers that you see in the cemetery here actually belong to members of an organization called Woodmen of the World. They were founded in 1890 in Omaha, Nebraska. The guy who started it wanted a society that would clear away problems of financial security for its members. So essentially, people who would join this Woodmen of the World Association, they could buy life insurance through the fraternal organization. They're still an organization that exists today. Actually, as of 2015, they started marketing themselves as a group called Woodmen Life. They also had a female auxiliary too. Their history includes a number of philanthropic efforts. They did community outreach projects, they presented American flags, etc. But that an early benefit to the membership was you could get these headstones too. So this person that is buried here is part of the Westervelt family, and the members included in the burial here are James Dallas Jr., Ralph, Charlotte, Emma, James D., and Luther. So like I said, you could get the life insurance through this group. So you'll notice in this section there are several of these like stump looking markers. Kind of an interesting fact, the first person in Niles to claim this perk of being a member of this organization was a guy named Willie D. Warner. He is buried in the city section of 4719, and he died in 1891. He had only been a member of the organization for about 6 weeks at the time. So just something to look for while you're going through this section. So this is our next stop. This is actually now the city section. This is city over here. And one of the people we're going to talk about is a guy by the name of Jacob K. Brown. And his marker is actually the one right over there. But members of his family are all around here too. So one of the themes we talk about on a lot of these tours are people who were like early families in the village of Niles. So this is like the late 1820s, 1830s, etc. So these families that were part of the founding of the village of Niles. And Jacob K. Brown was one of those individuals. He was born in Liberty, Indiana on August 29th, 1810. He moved to Niles in September of 1831, just a couple years after the village plat was filed. He was married in the 1830s to Sarah Stiff, and actually the ceremony was performed by Judge Green, who was the first judge in Niles. He was involved in a number of community endeavors, and actually, if you look at his obit, it actually says that Mr. Brown was too well known to require a lengthy obituary. So they just said everyone knew him. We don't have to list too many things he did. We know he was one of the first trustees of the village of Niles. He also, what he's really known for though, is he built a number of homes and other buildings in the community, including the Pike House, which was a precursor to where the Four Flags Hotel is today, on Main Street there, Main and Fourth. He built the Union School in Niles. He also built several buildings and structures on Main Street in the 1860s. He built a few homes for himself in the community. He built a house that was where the old post office is, like where the apartments are today. He built a structure that was there. He built a house for himself on the corner of 4th and Cedar Street. He also, according to his obit, and this is from his obit, so I don't know if this is an exaggeration or not, you know, sometimes they do in obits, it said he superintended the construction of 21 schoolhouses, a dozen mills, and at least a half-hundred of stores, dwelling houses, and other buildings in his life. Brown Street in Niles, which is on the west side, was named for him. That is where his one of the houses he built for himself, actually the last house he built for himself, it was located there. He died in 1890. But descendants of his family actually still live in the Niles community today. And he has a lasting legacy through some of these houses. Now, normally I show some pictures on these tours, and I will do some of that. However, I know it's really hard to see the pictures with the group size. So I also have a binder. And when we do refreshments or at the end of the tour, if you want to see any of these pictures up close, I will have that binder available and you can browse through it. But here's a picture of the Union School. So the Union School was located near where the post office is today in Niles. The post office and those like high-rise apartments over there, that was all part of the schools. They eventually built Central High School over there too, so it was a precursor to all of those. If you want to, the front side of the monument is over here. We're going to talk about the Carberry family. When we were planning this tour, one of the things that we talked about was the fact that, you know, in this section of the cemetery back here, you see some of these monuments from the road, and we figured, you know, people drive by these all the time and probably wonder, like, hey, I see this really cool marker. I wonder who they were. So we thought we could highlight a couple of these. One of them being the Carberry one. You may also know Carberry Road, too, in the area. That's actually named after this family. They were another of these pioneer families in Niles in the, around the time of the founding of the village of Niles. So Isaiah Carberry was born in Kentucky in 1800. When he was a child, his parents moved to Ohio, where he grew up, and he married a woman by the name of Susanna Brickett. She was born in 1803. In 1821, they moved, they married in 1821. 10 years later, in 1831, they moved to Niles with their two sons, John and Aaron, at the time. In 1840, he purchased the land where his homestead was, out on where Carberry Road is today. That house eventually burned in the early 1900s. We know Susanna died in 1849, and a year later he married a woman, Catherine Kinsey. She was born in 1823. We know he was engaged in some businesses in town. He worked for one of the mills for a while. For 24 years, he was also the Justice of the Peace in Howard Township, too. So he's another one of these people who were really in the early founding of the area, the village area. As I mentioned, at the time of his death, he died in, let me look at the time. He died in 1887. At the time of his death, his obit mentioned that he's going to have one of the nicest monuments in the cemetery at the time. So, yeah. So also you'll notice the top of the marker is that draped urn. That's kind of some of that symbolism in the cemetery too. It's one of the most common symbols found in the 19th century American cemeteries.
Okay, we are at the gravesite of Corporal Joseph Albert Nolan. And the reason we've chosen this is because he's the only Medal of Honor winner in Silverbrook Cemetery. And we've got people going back all the way back to the Revolutionary War. Joseph Nolan was born in Elkhart in 1857. His family moved to Niles. Shortly after that, he became a blacksmith. He worked for Elijah Murray, who worked for the Studebaker Company, and then he went out on his own. In 1898, at the age of 42, he joined the Army. He enlisted in South Bend. They went down to Indianapolis, eventually to Fort Snelling. He was in Company B of the 45th Infantry. Now I might add that this was at the end of the Spanish-American War. So after we conquered the Philippines with the help of the insurrectionists, they thought they were going to get freed. Unfortunately, we decided to keep it. And so now the insurrectionists are fighting us. And so we sent troops to quell the insurrection. And he was part of that group. Now he was stationed in Luzon in a place called Daet, spelled D-A-E-T. So at some point in time, in 1899, he was sent with a patrol to go to Labo, which was about 22 miles south of there. Now, on their way there, they're almost to Labo, and they run into insurrectionists. So they had to fight their way into the town. They were in the town for a couple of days. Then they were going to go back to Daet. Well, there's a river in front of Labo, the Labo River. So they get across the river, and they're besieged by 500 insurrectionists. The insurrectionists had gathered a bunch of people. So a firefight ensues. So they are driving these people back. Corporal Nolan and two other soldiers did a holding action. In fact, at one point in time, he was firing his gun so fast that he burned his hands. He ran out of ammunition. And these tribesmen had bolo knives. This guy came from behind him to cut his head off, and he turned around and headbutted him. And eventually they got back across the river to Labo. So they were holed up in this church. Now the church is pretty secure. It's got 5 feet walls. And the reason they have 5 feet walls is because of earthquakes. However, they're out of food. So they're there for 2 days, they're out of food, they're being shot at every time they go for water, so they're like, we need help. So Corporal Nolan and a guide set out to Daet to get help. So first they have to crawl from the church to the river. Then they have to swim the river, with their rifles. It's 700 feet wide. So they finally get across the river, and then they constantly run into insurrectionist patrols. So they managed to get that. They're on the road to Daet. They run across another patrol and they capture the patrol and proceed to Daet. And they're just outside of Daet, and they run into a relief corps. A group was coming to rescue the lost patrol, as it were. And they had 18 men. So Corporal Nolan says, yeah, you're going to have to get more men. So they go back to Daet, get more men. They march, and it's about 22 miles. So they march with Corporal Nolan leading them. They go back to the church, they rescue the men, and they come back. So, in 24 hours, Corporal Nolan had traversed that 22 miles 3 times, so he'd gone 70 miles. When he got done, there was blood rolling out of his boot. But the captain of the relief corps said, you'll get the Medal of Honor for this, and he was right. And the citation reads, voluntarily left shelter at great personal risk, passed the enemy lines and brought relief to besieged commands. Now I've got another thing here. That's General Bates of General Bell's brigade said it was the bravest piece of work ever performed in the archipelago by one man. Now, on a personal note, He was married 3 times. His first wife died in 1893. The second wife divorced him in 1899. His third wife survived him. They had 4 sons. He died in 1921. We know they lived on South St. Joe Avenue, and later around 1912 moved over to Mulberry Street, which is now 14th Street, sort of in the area of East Side School. So I guess that's all I've got. I hope you enjoyed it.
Next person that we're talking about is Sally Moody, and that is her marker right here. So Sally Moody, we know, was born in Tennessee in 1865, and we don't know much about her early life. According to ancestries, her parents were Jane and Henry Moody. We think her mother might have been born in Tennessee and her father was born in Mississippi. We don't know, like I said, as much about her early life. There is a local woman who is doing some research on her. She could not be part of the tour today, but she's trying to find out more information about her. And one of the things she wants to find out about her, or find about her, is a picture. We do not have a picture of her, but we'll talk about her story a little bit. We know she came to Niles in the early 1900s. She worked for several families in the area, including, we know, the Milburn family, who had a large house on Yankee Street, too, and some other families. Like I said, we'd like to do more research. We even know that in the 1890s, she bought a house in the area, too, and had a house in Niles. She died in South Bend on October 23rd, 1927. After her death, she left her estate minus the funds needed for a funeral and burial, and the amount amounted to about $6,748.43 to the Niles Library, saying that the library had always made her felt welcome, and it was a place where she felt the most at home at the time. At the time of her death and the time of this bequest, it was the largest individual donation to the library aside from when the building was built. And the library that we're talking about at the time would have been the large Carnegie Library on 4th and Main. Many of you might be familiar with the Carnegie Library. And actually, at one time, the library, the Carnegie Library, had a Sally Moody room, and they opened it in 1954 during the 50th anniversary of the library. Another little interesting fact about her, in 1928, at the time after her death, I mentioned that in her will she had left some funds for a funeral, and she left the rest to the library. She did not leave any funds for a marker at her grave. And so in 1928, a group of African-American citizens in Niles actually petitioned a probate judge to put this marker at her grave, saying that, you know, there was no mention of it in her will, but they felt she needed a marker, and that's the marker that we see today. Like I said, we would love to do more research on her, and there's someone in the area who's trying to do more research on her. So if you know any more information about Sally Moody and her connection to Niles, we would really love to hear it. So, Niles in 1861, he was the youngest of 7 children, born to Joseph Scala. According to his obit, he was actually one of the few remaining Nilesites christened in the old St. Francis Mission, which was a structure built on the site now occupied by St. Mary's Church. He had operated the Scala Furniture Company with his 3 brothers until the plant burned in 1913. The store had been founded by their father. We also know he served on the Niles police force during 1926 and 1927, and he was a member of the Knights of Columbus. On May 21st, 1890, he married Anna Brand in Illinois. They were married for 53 years. There are members of the Scala family still in Niles today, too. But that's another one I think you see from the road a lot, so I wanted to make sure we talk about that. Here. So we're going to talk about the Finley family. So just a little bit about them, because several members of the family are buried here at Silverbrook Cemetery too. And I mentioned Greenville and Melissa, they were down there, but they are a part of this family too, and we will talk about them. So Pasquale Finley and Sarah Newts Finley were kind of the matriarch and patriarch of the family. They are the first ones that came to Niles. They came to Niles in the 1840s. We know that in 1848, Pasquale worked for the Michigan Central Railroad. He was grading land for the new rail lines in Niles. By 1850, he had purchased land east of Niles near the present-day airport, and he was a farmer dealing in cattle. Pasquale and Sarah had 8 children: Ophelia, Mary Catherine, Cyrilda, Edward, Greenville, Sarah Frances, Permilia, Richard, and John. So there are many descendants of the Finley family, and like I said, there are still descendants in the area today. I did want to point out one of their sons, Greenville Finley. He was born in 1838 in Ohio, and that would have been before the family came to Niles. He was married to Melissa Hill on April 4th, 1860, and it's interesting because there is a connection, their family connection connects them to Lottie Wilson, who we are going to talk about the Wilson family a little bit later on the tour. Melissa Hill Finley was born in 1838, and her family was also from Ohio. They moved to Niles when she was a small child. According to their obits, they had, according to, I think, Greenville's obit, it said they had 11 children, and Melissa's obit said they had 10 children, too. And so, like I said, there are several descendants of the family too, and buried all around here. Sarah and Pasquale Finley and some other members of the family are buried at the Barren Lake Cemetery too, a little bit. But we know after Pasquale Finley's death, Sarah married Daniel Purcell and lived until 1895. Several descendants of the family still live in the area today. They host an annual reunion, sometimes held here in Niles too. And in 2017, the Niles City Council proclaimed September 10th as Finley Family Day. Does anybody want to say anything about the family?
I will just say that some of you probably remember, if you were at Niles High School, you will probably remember my grandmother, or if you bowled, which there's a tournament today at 12:30, Norma Taylor is my grandmother, who is a direct descendant of the Finley family. And we also have the distinction of being one of the oldest black families in the state of Michigan. So we're pretty cool. That's all I got.
He was on the Aviation Advisory Committee. He was on the Michigan Board of Aeronautics. He was a trustee of Alma College, and he was a founder of the local YMCA, and he was also a member of the state YMCA committee. I also found, according to his obituary, the first year of YMCA operations here, the entire budget was provided by the Tyler Company as well. He was also a member of various clubs in the area. He served on the city council for 3 years, beginning in 1934. On February 11th, 1926, he was married to Mary Witt Tyler. We know she was born in 1906. She was the daughter of Vernon and Rosa Witt. She was involved in the Niles community in a number of women's groups, including the Ladies Reading Club. She also wrote poetry. She published a book of poems called Colored Shawls and Other Poems in 1936, and dedicated it. It was dedicated to Jerry Tyler. Their son Michael was born in 1934. Now, Jerry Tyler was president of the Tyler Refrigeration Company until his tragic death in 1946 in the Chicago LaSalle fire. He died, his wife Mary died, and their son Michael died in the fire. After their deaths, his brother Robert Tyler actually took over the company, and he was president until 1969. At one time, though, Tyler Refrigeration was the global leader in the commercial refrigeration business as well. So, as I mentioned, the mausoleum is here. Okay. I just wanted to point this out before we start heading around this way. We actually have an early postcard of the cemetery here, too, in our collection at the History Center. And it shows a view from this angle. Too, and you can see that big cross too. So I wanted to point that out. If you're ever wondering if you see the postcard, we've used it in our advertising. It is supposed to show this angle. And the cross is for the Scorse family. Too, and we know some of the members of that family are buried here. John, James, Leah, Catlett, Alcides Jerome Scorse, and Minerva Almeida Scorse Clay, and Mary Ellen Bacon. If you're familiar, if you've been on the tours before, we've talked about the Bacon family, another family in Niles who were lawyers and judges early on. We don't know as much about them, but we do know that for example, in the 1870 census, John is listed as a cooper, and Alcides is in the Army. In 1882, we know Minerva married a man by the name of Martin Clay. And according to the newspaper article in the Chicago Tribune, it took place at Minerva's brother-in-law's house, Edward Bacon. He was married to Mary Ellen Scorse Bacon, and he was a lawyer in the area, too. So that's who's buried over there. But I think it's interesting because we have that postcard, and so people do ask sometimes about where is that in the cemetery. You can see it's right over in this area.
Excellent. Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? Good. A little chilly out today, but beautiful fall colors. I am representing Emily Coolidge Chapin, who is married into part of the Chapin family. If you're from around here, you've probably heard of the Chapin Mansion, and that is in fact the same name. I was born as Emily Coolidge in Edwardsburg on March 16th of 1849. To put that sort of into context, that's just a year after the California Gold Rush. So California actually plays two roles in my life. One of them is that year, and one of them is at the very end of my life. I was born in Edwardsburg to my father, who was a judge, and my mother, and raised with a number of siblings as well, who I believe we will get to hear about in the not-too-distant future. Is that correct, Molly?
Yeah.
Excellent. I went to school here in Niles with Niles Schools, and then continued on my education at the Kalamazoo Seminary. Very big difference. The Kalamazoo Seminary, where I studied music, specifically vocal and instrumental. I was a beautiful and accomplished soprano singer. At the age of 24, I married Charles Chapin. It was 1873, and together we had 8 children. In 1902, Charles was the only one of 4 children to still be surviving, and therefore he inherited the mansion on 5th Street and Main Street, right downtown Niles, from his parents, Henry and Ruby, who are buried kind of to the back here if you walk around when we are finished. We lived in Chicago by that point. We had been living in Chicago for about 5 or 6 years, and so we really just came back to the Chapin Mansion to stay whenever we were back in town. I and my husband were very involved in philanthropy and donating money and also volunteering. And one of the big things that we did was we sang at both the Presbyterian and Episcopalian churches here in Niles and in Edwardsburg, and then also donated quite a bit of money to the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and also the Chicago Civic Opera, both of them involved obviously in music and part of my passion and love in life. My brother Orville, who again you will hear about here pretty soon, is buried right across the way here. He had 2 nieces. I was especially proud of these 2 nieces. One of them, Florence, followed in her father's footsteps and continued on to be a writer, and also taught English, literature, and public speaking here at the Niles school system. And then his other daughter, Florence, was actually the first public librarian here in Niles. In 1913, Charles died of old age, and I basically just lived in Chicago after that point. I was very involved in philanthropy in Chicago, specifically in something called Chapin Hall, which used to be an orphanage and half asylum, and became largely just an orphanage. I was a strong believer that children deserve to have fresh air and a more open setting, which was a pretty progressive idea at the time. And so I donated $70,000, which helped to kickstart that entire project, and changed lots and lots of people's lives. I was also involved in the YMCA, churches there, and Boys Home in Chicago. And now, for those of you who like ghost stories, here's just a little bit of a ghost story. I moved into the Drake Hotel in Chicago. Have you ever heard of the Drake Hotel?
Yes.
Yeah? You're familiar with the ghost stories? to one of the most haunted hotels in Chicago, they say. I, of course, am not one of the hauntings. But in 1920, which was very soon after it was opened, there were rumors and an urban legend of a woman in red who unfortunately found her lover kissing somebody else on New Year's, went up to the 10th floor and jumped. And the ghost of the woman in red is still said to haunt the 10th floor. So if you go, watch out for her. A more tragic event that happened also at the Drake Hotel was the parents of Bobby, I want to make sure I say it right, yes, Bobby Franks. If you've ever heard of the Leopold and Loeb murders, Bobby Franks was a 15-year-old who was murdered in cold blood, and unfortunately the press had an absolute heyday with that, so much so to the point that his parents, Jacob and Flora, moved into the Drake Hotel and spent their time pretty much sequestered in that hotel, which was pretty much at the same time that I was there. I moved sort of back and forth, but spent some time out in California, which is where I died, in Pasadena. There's that California reference again, in 1925, right after my 76th birthday. So a nice peaceful end to my life. My family then brought me back here into Niles, and I am buried right here. We had 7 of my 8 children survive us, and so they were all in attendance at the funeral, as was Reverend Jones, who was the Reverend at the Presbyterian Church in Edwardsburg, to which I donated the church in my father's memory. Thank you so much for learning about Emily Coolidge Chapin today. Again, lots of family history, and you can still go and see the Chapin Mansion, where I spent a decent amount of my time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So that's going to do it for today's tour here at Silverbrook Cemetery. It was a pretty interesting tour. It's a lot different than some of the other ones I've been to. What made it really interesting was one of the family members who was a descendant of one of the people featured in this tour had a few things to say, and it was pretty nice to see the connection to history when people were walking around. But it's a beautiful cemetery, and I don't think I got the complete tour. There was a lot of people in this one, and they were taking a lot of time, and I had a prior engagement I have to get to, but I wanted to show this tour to you. I hope you enjoyed it. It's a fascinating, wonderful piece of history, and I'm going to put the organizations that sponsored the tour in the description of the video and in the credits, so check them out. And be sure to join their tour next year when they hold it. It's a great cemetery, a lot of history here, and I hope you join me next time. If you liked today's video, please take a minute to hit the like button down there, subscribe to the channel, share the video with others, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.